The vault door clicked shut behind Nathaniel Ashford at exactly 11:47 p.m., sealing him inside the Maritime Heritage Museum's most secure archive. He'd come for a file he'd left earlier. Instead, he found a woman in a preservation worker's apron, hunched over documents that required Level 5 clearance, her fingers flying across a keyboard, her lips moving silently as she worked through calculations that had stumped his entire research department for months. Isla Morwin didn't hear him enter. She was too deep in the code, too focused on the pattern she'd finally cracked after 3 weeks of stolen lunch breaks and midnight investigations. The Admiral Strand charts spread before her weren't just historical navigation documents. They were a 200-year-old treasure map, and she'd just figured out how to read it. When Nathaniel cleared his throat, Isla spun so fast her chair nearly tipped. Her face went pale. Her hands froze above the keyboard. And in that moment, both their lives changed forever. But here's what you need to understand. This isn't just a story about a woman getting discovered. This is about what happens when brilliance is forced into hiding, when expertise learns that speaking up costs everything, when the smartest person in the room spends years emptying trash cans because the alternative destroyed her the first time she tried it. Have you ever worked a job you were overqualified for? Have you ever bitten your tongue when you knew the answer? Stayed quiet when you could have solved the problem? Made yourself small because being big got you hurt? Then you already know Isla's world. You already understand why a woman with a doctorate from Oxford was repairing book bindings in a museum basement at 28 years old. Why her canvas apron had more authority in that building than her actual mind. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, hit that like button. This story is for you. Because what happened in that vault wasn't just about decoding ancient charts. It was about a CEO who chose to see instead of dismiss, to listen instead of assume, to recognize that the most valuable person in his institution was the one he'd been walking past every day. And it was about a woman who had to decide whether being seen was worth the risk of being destroyed all over again. Let me take you back to where this really begins. Not in the vault at midnight, but 8 months earlier, when Isla Morwin first learned the geography of invisibility. The basement of the Maritime Heritage Museum smelled like old paper and chemical preservatives. Isla had grown to love that smell. It meant solitude. It meant the freedom to think without performing, to work without being watched, to exist in a space where no one expected anything from her except restored bindings and properly cataloged acidity levels. She arrived each evening at 6 p.m. Just as the day shift preservationists were leaving, they'd nod politely, sometimes comment on the weather, never staying long enough for actual conversation. Isla preferred it that way. Small talk required energy she didn't have, forced a brightness she couldn't sustain. By 7 p.m., the building was mostly empty. Security made rounds every few hours, but they knew Isla, the quiet one, the night worker, no trouble. Her workspace occupied a corner of the preservation lab, surrounded by shelves of damaged documents waiting for attention. Ship manifests with water stains, captain's logs with degraded bindings, letters from sailors to families they'd never see again, the ink fading like the memories themselves. Isla's hands moved with practiced precision. Apply adhesive, position the binding, apply pressure, wait. The work was meditative, requiring just enough focus to occupy her conscious mind while leaving the rest free to wander. That's where most people would have gotten bored. But Isla had a secret that made even routine preservation work fascinating. She actually read what she repaired, not just skimming, reading, analyzing, connecting patterns across documents that had arrived from different estates, different time periods, different donors. The museum treated these items as individual artifacts. Isla saw them as pieces of a larger puzzle. 3 months into the job, she'd identified a previously unknown trade route by cross-referencing damaged manifests. She'd said nothing. 5 months in, she'd spotted anachronistic language in a letter supposedly from 1762, revealing it as a 19th century forgery. She'd quietly moved it to the separate archive for questionable attributions, leaving a note about paper composition inconsistencies. No explanation, no Shu Ming, because Isla had learned the hard way that brilliance without power was just a target. Dr. Marcus Whitmore had taught her that lesson thoroughly. Oxford had been everything Isla dreamed. The libraries, the resources, the community of scholars who spoke her language, who understood that spending 6 hours analyzing medieval Portolan charts wasn't obsessive. It was passion. She'd specialized in cartographic history, focusing on how navigation knowledge transferred across cultures. Her doctoral research had uncovered evidence that medieval European mapmakers had access to mathematical techniques that supposedly didn't exist in their geographic region for another century. The implications were staggering. It suggested knowledge networks far more sophisticated than conventional history acknowledged. Dr. Whitmore had been her advisor. Brilliant, everyone said. Published extensively, highly respected in the field. He'd encouraged her work, praised her insights, asked detailed questions about her methodology, her sources, her analysis. And then he'd published it all under his own name, not even as a collaborative work, not even with her name buried in the acknowledgments. Just his research, his breakthrough, his career-defining publication. When Isla had confronted him privately, he'd looked genuinely confused. These are collaborative findings, he'd said, based on research conducted in my lab, under my supervision, using resources I provided. That's how academic attribution works. When she'd pushed back, he'd grown cold. You're a doctoral candidate, Miss Morwen. I'm a tenured professor with 30 years of experience. Do you really think anyone will believe you developed these insights independently? When she'd gone to the department head, she'd been told that Dr. Whitmore's version of events seemed more credible, that perhaps she was too emotionally invested, that maybe she should consider whether academia was the right fit if she couldn't handle collaborative environments. The Whisper network had been efficient. Within weeks, Isla was unhireable, too difficult, too possessive of her work, unable to function in team settings. The words followed her from interview to interview, opportunity to opportunity, until there were no more opportunities. So she'd stopped trying. She'd taken the first job that didn't require references from her former department. Night shift preservation work, minimum qualifications needed, no questions asked. And she'd learned to be invisible. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent years studying how knowledge got attributed, how discoveries traveled from one person to another, how history remembered some contributors while erasing others. Now she was living that erasure, a ghost in her own story. But invisibility had unexpected advantages. Working nights meant access to files, to research, to information that day shift workers never bothered examining because they were too focused on their assigned projects. Isla wasn't assigned projects. She was assigned repairs, which meant everything she saw was technically within her purview, even if analyzing it wasn't part of her job description. The Admiral Strand portfolio had arrived on a Tuesday, estate donation from a descendant who'd found the documents in an attic. The preliminary assessment noted 18th century maritime charts, potentially valuable, needed condition evaluation before determining exhibition viability. It had been assigned to Isla for initial preservation review. She'd started routinely, checking paper composition, noting tears and stains, documenting the binding condition, all standard procedure. But something had nagged at her. The charts were beautiful, precisely drawn coastlines, elegant mathematical notations, the kind of craftsmanship that indicated serious expertise. But the numbers were wrong, not obviously wrong, not damaged or faded wrong, just slightly, consistently off. Latitude calculations that didn't quite match the coastal features, depth measurements that seemed arbitrary, notational symbols that appeared standard but didn't align with period conventions when you actually checked them against other 18th century documents. Most people would have assumed transcription errors, period inconsistencies, the kind of minor variations that plague historical documents. Isla saw a pattern because this was her specialty. This was exactly the kind of thing her stolen research had focused on, how mapmakers embedded information, how knowledge got disguised as something else, how the real message often hid beneath the obvious one. She should have logged it and moved on, should have noted the inconsistencies in her condition report and let the actual researchers investigate. Instead, she'd spent her lunch break in the museum's reference library, pulling 18th century navigation manuals, then another lunch break cross referencing symbol systems, then a week of lunch breaks analyzing the mathematical progressions until she'd isolated the pattern. The notations weren't errors. They were substitutions, a cipher layered over the geographic data. And once she'd cracked the substitution key, the real map had emerged. Not navigation instructions for sailing, location coordinates for finding, the Persephone, the legendary merchant vessel that had vanished in 1784 with a cargo so valuable that treasure hunters had been searching for it for 2 centuries. Every expedition had failed. Most historians had concluded the ship never existed, or its cargo had been exaggerated by legend. But these charts said otherwise. They indicated the Persephone hadn't sunk in a storm. It had been deliberately scuttled, hidden in a specific location, and someone, presumably Admiral Strand, had created an encrypted record of exactly where. Isla's hands had trembled as the pattern resolved. This was the kind of discovery that made careers, that rewrote historical narratives, that got you tenure, book deals, international recognition. It was also the kind of discovery that could be stolen, so she documented everything meticulously, photographed her analysis, time-stamped her notes, created a paper trail that would prove she'd done this work even if no one believed her. And then she'd kept investigating, alone, during hours when no one would interrupt, which is how she'd ended up in the vault at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, so focused on her breakthrough that she didn't hear the director of the entire museum walk in behind her. You won't believe what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss how this CEO responds when he finds his preservation worker solving a mystery his entire research team couldn't crack. Nathaniel Ashford had a reputation for intensity. He'd transformed 3 failing cultural institutions into world-class facilities by working longer hours than anyone else, demanding excellence, and refusing to accept that budget limitations meant accepting mediocrity. He'd been appointed director of the Maritime Heritage Museum 3 months earlier with a clear mandate: fix the funding crisis, restore relevance, make people care about maritime history again. He'd been making progress: new donor relationships, rebranded programming, strategic media partnerships. But he was exhausted, which is why he'd come back to his office at nearly midnight to grab files he'd need for an early morning meeting. The building should have been empty, except for security. Finding someone in the restricted archive, accessing classified documents, wasn't just irregular. It was a security breach. His first instinct had been anger. His second had been to call security. But then he'd actually looked at what she was doing: the charts spread across the examination table, the handwritten calculations covering 3 full notebooks, the computer screen showing complex pattern analysis, the absolute focus on her face as she worked through something that clearly mattered deeply. This wasn't theft. This was research. "What are you doing?" he'd said, and watched her nearly fall out of her chair. The woman spun to face him, young, maybe late 20s, wearing a preservation department apron over casual clothes, blonde hair escaping from a practical ponytail, hands stained with the residue of old leather and conservation chemicals, and eyes that held absolute terror. "I'm so sorry," she'd stammered, standing quickly and backing away from the computer. "I was cataloging the Strand portfolio, and I noticed something in the charts, and I know I shouldn't have accessed them outside my assignment, but I thought if I could just verify the pattern." She was talking too fast, explaining too much, clearly expecting to be fired. Nathaniel held up one hand. "Slow down. Start with your name. Isla Morwen, Preservation Department, night shift." He'd walked past her dozens of times in 3 months and never registered her existence. That realization made him uncomfortable. "And you're accessing the Admiral Strand acquisition because you noticed something." "Yes, sir. I was assigned to assess its condition for storage, which is my job. But then I saw inconsistencies in the navigational notations and I realized they weren't errors. They were intentional variations, and when I analyzed the pattern, it revealed." She stopped, seemed to realize she was still explaining without permission. "Revealed what?" Nathaniel prompted. Isla looked at him, really looked, like she was trying to determine whether honesty would save her or destroy her. "A map," she finally said, "hidden inside the navigation charts, encrypted using 18th century cartographic steganography. It shows the location of the Persephone." "The Persephone," Nathaniel repeated. "The merchant vessel that's basically considered a legend." "Yes, sir. And you decoded this how, exactly?" Isla's chin lifted slightly. "Because I have a doctorate in cartographic history from Oxford, specializing in how navigation knowledge was transmitted and disguised across cultures. This kind of encoded mapping is exactly what my research focused on." The words hung in the air between them. "You have a doctorate from Oxford," Nathaniel said slowly, "and you're working night shift preservation." Yes, sir. Why? It wasn't really a question, but Isla answered anyway. Because sometimes having credentials means people expect you to contribute, and sometimes contributing gets you hurt. So I took a job where no one expected anything except repaired bindings and proper acidity assessments, where I could work alone and not explain myself. The bitterness in her voice was carefully controlled, but unmistakable. This woman had been damaged by someone, badly enough that she was hiding a doctorate behind an apron. Show me, Nathaniel said. Show me what you found. For the next 4 hours, Isla Morwen did something she hadn't done since Oxford. She talked about her work like it mattered. She walked Nathaniel through the charts, pointing out the notational inconsistencies that most people would dismiss as period variations. She explained how 18th century mapmakers sometimes embedded secondary information in their documents, using mathematical substitution ciphers that looked like standard navigational data. She showed him her analysis. 3 weeks of work, conducted during lunch breaks and after hours, meticulously documented. The substitution key she'd identified, the coordinates that emerged when you extracted the anomalies and reconstructed them according to period cryptographic conventions. And she explained why those coordinates mattered. The Persephone hadn't been lost in a storm. It had been deliberately concealed, scuttled in a specific underwater canyon off the Scottish coast, its cargo preserved, and its location documented by someone who'd gone to extraordinary lengths to encrypt that information. Nathaniel asked questions, sharp ones. He challenged her assumptions, pushed her to defend her methodology, questioned whether she might be seeing patterns that didn't exist. But he was listening, actually listening, not dismissing, not condescending, not explaining to her what her own research meant, just engaging with the work on its merits. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. This is remarkable, Nathaniel finally said, as dawn started filtering through the vault's small windows. If you're right, this is one of the most significant maritime discoveries in decades. The Persephone's cargo alone would be invaluable, but the historical implications of a deliberately concealed vessel with encrypted location documentation. He turned to face her fully. Why didn't you bring this to someone? Why investigate alone? Because in my experience, Isla said quietly, when women bring discoveries to people with authority, one of two things happens. Either they get dismissed as overreaching, or they get taken seriously, and then the discovery gets attributed to someone more credible. She met his eyes. I already lost one career to a man who stole my research and then destroyed my reputation when I tried to speak up. I couldn't afford to lose this job too, even if this job is beneath my qualifications. So I documented everything privately, made sure I could prove this was my work, and kept my mouth shut. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. That man who stole your research, the facial recognition work that Anderson Technologies published 3 years ago. Isla blinked. How did you know? Because I followed that publication when it came out. The methodology was brilliant, genuinely innovative, and I remember thinking the credited researcher didn't seem capable of that level of sophisticated analysis in his other work. He paused. It was yours, wasn't it? I can't prove it, Isla said. Not legally. He had access to all my notes, all my research. When I tried to establish attribution, I became the problem. Too emotional, too possessive, unable to collaborate, and then I was unhirable. Her voice remained steady, but Nathaniel could hear the carefully controlled pain beneath it. This woman had been systematically destroyed for being brilliant. The wrongness of it made his chest tight. I'm going to make you an offer, he said carefully, and I need you to really think about it before you answer, because I understand you have excellent reasons not to trust men in positions of authority who make offers. Isla's expression became guarded. All right, I want you to lead the research project on these charts, not as a consultant, not as an assistant, as the principal investigator. Your name, your work, your discovery, with a formal contract that includes legal protections, ensuring attribution can't be stolen or reassigned. He paused. I also want you to consider a permanent position as our Director of Cartographic Research. It's a role we don't currently have, but desperately need. Market rate salary, full benefits, and my personal commitment that this institution will value your expertise instead of exploiting it. Isla stared at him. Why? Because my sister was a marine biologist, Nathaniel said quietly. Brilliant, passionate. She developed groundbreaking research on coral reef regeneration. Her department head took credit for it, published under his own name, and when she tried to speak up, he destroyed her credibility so thoroughly that she left academia entirely. She teaches high school science now. She says she's happy, but I know she still mourns what she lost. His hands tightened into fists. I watched someone I love be diminished by a system that should have celebrated her. I can't fix what happened to her, but I can make sure it doesn't happen in institutions I lead. I can create environments where brilliance gets protected instead of punished. He looked at Isla directly. I'm not the man who stole your research. I won't become him, and I understand you need proof of that, not just promises. So I'm offering you a contract with legal protections, a position with authority, and my commitment to ensuring your work remains yours. The only question is whether you're willing to risk being visible again. The silence stretched between them. Isla's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'll need that in writing, she finally said. All of it. You'll have it by morning, Nathaniel promised, along with a formal apology from me for the fact that you've been working here for 8 months and I never noticed we had someone extraordinary repairing book bindings when she should have been making discoveries. Isla took off her yellow preservation gloves, set them carefully on the examination table, extended her hand. Then I accept. If this story is inspiring you, drop a comment telling me about a time you felt invisible. Let's build a community of people who refuse to hide. And hit that like button if you believe brilliance deserves to be seen. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Isla had spent 4 years learning to be invisible, unlearning that conditioning required more than a contract and a title change. Her first day as director of cartographic research, she'd arrived at the museum at 6 a.m., 2 hours before anyone else. She'd stood outside the building, staring at her reflection in the glass doors, wearing professional clothes instead of her preservation apron, carrying a briefcase instead of conservation supplies, and she'd almost turned around, because being visible meant being vulnerable. It meant people would have expectations. It meant failure would be public instead of private. It meant risking everything all over again. But Nathaniel had been waiting in the lobby. He'd somehow known she'd need someone to walk in with her that first day. Ready? He'd asked. No, she'd admitted. Good. If you were completely confident, I'd worry you didn't understand the stakes. He'd held the door open. But you're going to do it anyway. The research team had been skeptical at first. A preservation worker promoted to director overnight. Someone with no publications since her doctoral work, no track record, no proof she could handle a project this significant. Isla had expected the skepticism. What surprised her was Nathaniel's response to it. He'd called a full staff meeting her first week, stood in front of the entire research department, and explained exactly why Isla had been hired, showed her analysis of the strand charts, detailed her doctoral credentials, and made clear that questioning her authority was questioning his judgment. Dr. Morwin solved a puzzle our entire department missed, he'd said. Not because she's lucky, because she's better at this than we are. And if that makes anyone uncomfortable, they're welcome to reconsider their position here. No one had reconsidered, but the message had been clear. Still, Isla waited for the other shoe to drop, for Nathaniel to start taking credit, to start steering her research, to start treating her discoveries as collaborative findings from his institution rather than her individual work. It never happened. Instead, he'd insisted her name appear first on every publication, deferred to her expertise in meetings, corrected people who tried to attribute her findings to the museum generally, rather than to her specifically. And when a prominent historian had suggested the Persephone project would benefit from more experienced leadership, Nathaniel had calmly noted that Isla possessed more expertise in cartographic cryptography than anyone else in the field, and the suggestion was declined. The support was relentless, unwavering, and gradually, Isla began to believe it might be real. The Persephone investigation consumed 18 months. Isla assembled a team of marine archaeologists, historians, and technical specialists. They conducted archival research across 3 countries, analyzed contemporary accounts of Admiral Strand's activities, built computer models of 18th century scuttling techniques, and they planned an expedition to the coordinates Isla had decoded. The research vessel departed from Aberdeen on a gray morning in March. Isla stood on deck, watching Scotland's coastline recede, and felt the weight of everything riding on this moment. If she was wrong, The museum would lose credibility. Nathaniel would face questions about judgment. Her career would be damaged again, possibly permanently. If she was right, everything changed. The underwater canyon Isla had identified was nearly 300 feet deep, too deep for conventional diving, requiring specialized submersibles and remotely operated vehicles. The first 2 days of searching found nothing, just empty ocean floor and scattered geological formations. On the third day, the submersible's sonar detected an anomaly. Isla had been in the research vessel's control room when the image appeared on screen, a shape that didn't match natural formations, too regular, too symmetrical. The submersible moved closer, its cameras adjusted, and suddenly, impossibly, there it was, the Persephone, intact, perfectly preserved by the canyon's cold water and low oxygen environment. The control room had erupted in chaos, people shouting, hugging, celebrating. The archaeologists were already planning recovery operations. The historians were calculating the historical significance. But Isla had walked out onto the deck alone. She'd stood at the railing, staring at the ocean that held a ship she'd found by decoding 200-year-old charts during her lunch breaks while wearing preservation gloves. And she'd let herself feel it. The fierce satisfaction of being right. The vindication of trusting her expertise, even when no one else had. The transformation from invisible to undeniable. Nathaniel had found her there as the sun was setting. "How does it feel?" he'd asked. "Like I'm allowed to exist again," Isla had said. "Like maybe brilliance doesn't have to hide." "It never should have had to," Nathaniel replied. "But I'm glad you stopped." The Persephone's cargo had been extraordinary. Not gold or jewels, but something more valuable. A complete archive of 18th century scientific instruments, botanical specimens, and ethnographic documentation from Pacific expeditions. Materials that rewrote understanding of global knowledge exchange during the period. And every publication, every article, every academic paper had Isla's name prominently featured, not as a contributor, as the lead researcher, the person whose work had made the discovery possible. Dr. Marcus Whitmore's reputation, meanwhile, had quietly collapsed. Once Isla's work gained prominence, other former students had come forward with similar stories. A pattern of appropriation spanning decades had emerged. His publications were being re-evaluated. His legacy was being reconsidered. Isla felt no satisfaction in his downfall, just a quiet recognition that truth eventually surfaced, even when powerful people tried to bury it. 2 years after that night in the vault, Isla received an offer from Cambridge, chair of maritime history, prestigious, influential, the kind of position that would have been her dream a decade earlier. She'd been sitting in her office at the museum when the email arrived, staring at the words without quite processing them. Nathaniel had knocked on her door an hour later. "Cambridge contacted me for a reference," he'd said. "I told them you're the most talented cartographic historian I've ever worked with, and they'd be fortunate to have you. You want me to take it," Isla had said. "I want you to choose what makes you happy." He'd settled into the chair across from her desk. "You'd be brilliant there. You'd transform their program. But you'd also be brilliant here. The question is, what you want." Isla had looked around her office, at the Persephone research files, at the preliminary plans for the museum's new Center for Cartographic Studies, at the fellowship applications sitting on her desk, researchers with non-traditional backgrounds looking for opportunities. "I spent 4 years hiding," she'd said slowly, "working jobs beneath my qualifications because I was afraid of being visible. And then you gave me a chance to stop hiding. Not just a job, but an environment where my expertise was valued instead of exploited." She'd met Nathaniel's eyes. Cambridge is an honor, but it's also someone else's institution, someone else's vision. Here, I get to build something. I get to create the kind of environment I needed when I was desperate. I get to be the person who sees other people the way you saw me. "So you're staying," Nathaniel had said. "I'm staying if you'll approve the Center for Cartographic Studies." He'd smiled. "The board already approved it. They're also offering you the director position, substantial budget, research support, and autonomy to build the program however you see fit." Isla had felt tears prick her eyes. "You already knew I'd say no to Cambridge." "I hoped," Nathaniel had said, "but I would have supported whatever decision you made." That's what actual mentorship looks like. Not controlling your choices, supporting them, 3 years after the Persephone discovery, Isla sat in her office at the Center for Cartographic Studies, reviewing fellowship applications. The center had become internationally recognized, attracting researchers from around the world, particularly researchers who didn't fit traditional academic molds, people with employment gaps, people who'd left academia after bad experiences, people whose brilliance had been overlooked because they didn't match conventional expectations. Isla had built the center intentionally as a space where expertise mattered more than pedigree, where researchers received credit for their work with legal protections ensuring attribution couldn't be stolen, where speaking up was encouraged instead of punished. One application caught her attention. A woman who'd spent 5 years working administrative jobs after leaving a doctoral program. No publications, no references from her former department, but her writing sample showed sophisticated analysis of medieval trade route documentation. Isla flagged it for serious consideration. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Nathaniel stood in the doorway. "How's the fellowship review?" he asked. "Overwhelming. We have twice as many qualified applicants as positions." The problem of success. He'd set a coffee cup on her desk. "Though I notice you flagged several applications from people with non-traditional career paths. People whose expertise isn't immediately obvious from their resumes," Isla had said. "People who might be repairing bookbindings somewhere, waiting for someone to notice they're capable of more. People like you," Nathaniel had said gently. "People who deserve someone to see them," Isla had corrected. "The way you saw me, that wasn't charity," Nathaniel had said. "You solved a problem my entire research team couldn't crack. I didn't give you an opportunity out of kindness. I gave it to you because you'd already proven you were extraordinary. I just had to stop being blind long enough to notice." Isla had smiled. "That's the thing, though. Choosing to notice is what matters. Most people walked past me for 8 months. You chose to pay attention when you found me somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, doing something I wasn't authorized to do. That choice changed everything." She gestured to the fellowship applications. "Now, I get to make those choices. I get to look for brilliance in unexpected places and give people chances they shouldn't have to fight for. I get to be the person I needed when I was desperate." "The cycle continues," Nathaniel had said. "The cycle transforms," Isla had corrected. "I'm not replicating what happened to me. I'm building something where that moment of being discovered doesn't have to be miraculous, where expertise is expected to come from anywhere, where people don't have to hide and hope someone eventually notices." She'd stood, looking out her window at the museum's exhibition hall below, where the Persephone's artifacts were displayed under her name. "I was invisible for 4 years," Isla had said quietly. "And then someone chose to see me. That changed my life. But what changes the world is making sure the next generation doesn't have to be invisible in the first place." That evening, Isla walked through the museum after hours, past the Persephone exhibition that had made her famous, past the cartographic collections that researchers traveled internationally to access, past the portrait gallery that now included her own face. She stopped in front of her portrait. Dr. Isla Morwin, director of the Center for Cartographic Studies. Professional attire, confident expression, nothing like the woman who'd repaired bindings in a basement, but also exactly like her, because Isla had never stopped being brilliant. She'd only stopped being visible. The difference now was understanding that visibility didn't require vulnerability, that taking up space didn't automatically invite destruction, that the right environment could transform what had once been dangerous into something powerful. She thought about the fellowship applications waiting in her office, about the researchers whose brilliance was hiding in administrative jobs, preservation departments, careers that didn't match their capabilities, about the choices she'd make in the coming weeks, who to see, who to support, who to give the chance that Nathaniel had given her, because that was the real legacy of the Persephone discovery, not the ship itself, or the historical significance, or even Isla's restored career. The legacy was the understanding that brilliance was everywhere, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to look carefully enough to see it. And when you'd been seen, when you'd been valued, when you'd been given the chance to stop hiding, the most meaningful thing you could do was ensure others didn't have to hide either. Isla turned from her portrait and walked back to her office, back to the fellowship applications, back to the work of building a world where expertise didn't have to justify its existence, where women didn't have to choose between safety and visibility, where the person repairing book bindings might also be the person who changed everything. Because she'd been that person, the one everyone walked past, the one whose brilliance was invisible until someone chose to see it. And now, she was the one doing the seeing. The cycle hadn't just continued, it had transformed, and with it, the possibility of what came next. So here's what I want you to remember from Isla's story. Your current position doesn't define your potential. The job you're working right now, the role you're filling, the way people see you or don't see you, none of that limits what you're actually capable of. Isla had a doctorate from Oxford and was repairing book bindings, but she was always brilliant. The work didn't change her capabilities, it just hid them. Maybe you're in a similar place, working beneath your qualifications, staying quiet when you know the answer, making yourself small because being big got you hurt before. That's not weakness, that's survival. And there's no shame in surviving. But if someone offers you a chance to stop hiding, if someone chooses to see you, if someone recognizes what you're capable of and gives you the opportunity to prove it, take it. Take it even though it's terrifying. Take it even though you might fail. Take it even though the last time you were visible, you got destroyed. Because the right environment changes everything. The right support transforms survival into success. The right person seeing you can shift your entire trajectory. Nathaniel didn't save Isla. Isla saved herself by continuing to be brilliant even when no one was watching, but Nathaniel created the conditions where her brilliance could become visible again, where her expertise could be valued instead of stolen, where her voice could matter. And then, Isla did something even more important. She used her visibility to see others. She built systems where the next generation wouldn't have to hide. She became the person she'd needed when she was desperate. That's the cycle we need. Not hurt people, hurting people, but seen people seeing people, valued people valuing people, supported people supporting people. If this story moved you, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Mr. Andy Love Stories for more narratives that inspire transformation. And drop a comment answering this question. What talent are you hiding? What expertise are you keeping invisible because you're afraid of being hurt again? It's time to be seen, not recklessly, not without protection, but intentionally in environments that value you, with people who will support rather than exploit your brilliance. You're not just watching stories here, you're joining a community of people who refuse to stay invisible, who believe that everyone deserves to be seen, who understand that the most valuable discoveries often come from the people no one's paying attention to. Isla was repairing book bindings when she decoded a 200-year-old mystery. She was wearing preservation gloves when she made a career-defining discovery. She was invisible when she proved she was extraordinary. The only question was whether anyone would notice. Nathaniel noticed, and everything changed. So pay attention to the people around you, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones doing work beneath their capabilities, because the system failed them. They might be brilliant, they might be extraordinary, they might be exactly what you need. You just have to choose to see them. And if you're the one who's invisible right now, if you're the one hiding your expertise behind job titles that don't match your abilities, know this: your brilliance doesn't need permission, but it does need opportunity. Keep documenting your work, keep developing your skills, keep being excellent even when no one's watching, because eventually someone will notice. Eventually someone will see you. Eventually someone will offer you the chance to stop hiding. And when that moment comes, when someone extends their hand and asks you to be visible again, take it, and show them what you can do. Take it and transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone who comes after you. Take it and build the world where brilliance doesn't have to hide anymore. That's Isla's legacy. That's the lesson of the Persephone. That's the story of what happens when someone chooses to see instead of overlook, to value instead of exploit, to support instead of steal. One choice, one moment, one CEO finding his preservation worker solving a crisis and choosing to listen instead of dismiss. And 2 lives changed forever. Now go change someone else's life. Go see someone who's invisible. Go be the Nathaniel in someone's story. The world has enough people overlooking brilliance. Be the one who notices it instead. And if you're waiting to be seen, keep going. Keep being extraordinary. Keep documenting your work and developing your expertise. Your moment is coming. Your Nathaniel is coming. Your chance to stop hiding is coming. Just be ready when it arrives, because you're not just a preservation worker. You're not just whatever job title you're currently hiding behind. You're brilliant. You're capable. You're extraordinary. You're just waiting for someone to notice, and they will.